I helped and made the wines with Robert Haas and the Pren brothers, Francois. In those days, the kids were still young, and we made all those wines at Adelaida Cellars. So the Marsanne that we're going to have tonight is under John and I's watch over there at Adelaida. I don't have any clue how many cases we made. Don't remember. I can tell you the vineyard was planted in 1992. So this was 4-year-old grapevines, and I think all of us involved were really, really excited at the time to the first wines getting off the ground. And the first vintage of anything was a 94. So this was the second time we made anything. And this label was just one vintage. Vineyard Dry was a Marsanne and a Mourvedre. And the story of why that is long. We don't need to get into. But anyway, John.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Cheers. Here, let me pour you some Marsanne.
Marsanne.
Here, rinse that glass out a little bit. You got chunks from between your teeth or something. Not that we had a glass before the show.
No, we wouldn't have thought of that.
So, really, I guess John's been in the business for a long time, starting with Tonio Conti champagne, and I think we skipped to when you met the Prens. Being that it's essentially a Tablas Creek show, not a John O'Neill show.
Yeah.
Cheers. By the way.
Cheers. Yeah. That's lovely. It's really holding, isn't it?
We would have never thought that we'd be drinking this one. What is that, 24 years later?
No, what happened was I know that the Perrins and Bob Haas had been looking all over the West Coast and other places, I think, to do a New World winery. And they just couldn't find the kinds of soils or the setting that they wanted for the types of grapes they wanted to do. And their search was headed by a character that looked sort of like a hobbit, Charlie Falk, who was one of the marketing people for Bob Haas. And at one point, my understanding is they were pretty well frustrated and, they just couldn't find what they wanted, which was essentially limestone chalk rock conditions that emulate or equate to what they had at Beaucastel. Yeah. And they had been up visiting for the umpteenth time with Randall Graham, and just as a thought, he said, "Have you visited with Munch yet?" Because he's doing a Syrah. And I said, "Well, we'll go check. Paso Robles, we'll go check." And at the time,
so to put some context, this would have been like 86, 87?
87, in that range around then. It might have been even 88, I don't know.
I was still in elementary school.
Yeah, wow. So they made an appointment, and at the time, I had set up a winery to the northeast of town that is Castoro Cellars now, and Neil Zusen of Castoro and I were running that. I had my group from Francis Champagne, people from the Côte de Blanc, and Niels was doing his Castoro, and I was doing Adelaida Cellars, which was my initial still wine brand, and I hadn't even thought of Le Cuvier at the time as a brand. I had a couple of barrels of the Syrah, and they showed up, and it's always amused me that the four of them, you could see that they were not pleased because they were looking at sandy rolling hills, sandy loam and whatnot, not what they wanted. So I take a thief and pull a shot out of the barrel of the Syrah, pour it in their glasses, and it was to me like if it had been choreographed. They first look in their glasses, they look out the window that was behind us, they look back in their glasses, they look at me, they don't even taste at that point. They said, "This was not grown here, this didn't come from here." And I said, "No, it came from the up in the hills of my own little vineyard. It's all limestone. Take us there, show us, So rather than take them up to my place, which is where Le Cuvier is now, and I bought the property, I think in 78 and built there. I took them out on Peachy Canyon Road where you can really see the geology as it comes up from
the cutaways on the corners.
The cutaways, yeah. And they literally were screaming at Charlie to stop the car and jumping up out of the car before he could stop it because you were seeing the roots from the oaks popping out through limestone and whatnot. And
still an impressive drive.
It's still
even
impressive.
Though you know it's there. I love that drive.
It's a great drive because it really shows you what's happening. And I think, as I understand the if you will, the geology goes north to south, popping up on the south. So you really see it on those cuts that you wouldn't see on a north slope, for example. And they took samples. We were involved with them looking at some of the properties that Don Van Steenwyck, who ultimately took over and bought me out of Adelaida, his properties and whatnot. But they were taking samples of the soils around. They didn't want to do the analysis here. They wanted to do it in France.
Right.
And
Of course.
yeah, it turned out that indeed these soils are even worse than theirs. So they were very delighted,
Right.
you know. And I think from there, it wasn't. When did they ultimately buy the Tablas property?
89, 90.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they started into escrow in 89 and closed in 90 or something like that.
So it would have probably not been this bottle, which is an 89, but the predecessor, the 88 or even the 87 that they tasted and freaked out because of the color and the smells and the rest of it.
Right. And I mean, initially they were at that point, I believe, looking very seriously at a property down in Santa Barbara, which is now Stoltman Vineyards. But when they found that soil and that there's that band of limestone that goes through West Paso, they've abandoned the Santa Barbara. And a large part of that, I think, was that they just didn't feel they could ripen more bed to their liking.
To their liking down there, yeah.
And so that happened. They planted grapevines, and I was certainly there the day the first vine went in the ground, and I think you were there too, a Grenache vine. And they planted vineyard, and of course they had no winery. So because of that connection was already there, the property they bought was, 4 miles down the road from Adelaida Cellars. So they were bringing their grapes to Adelaida Cellars, and John and I were helping to make them.
But they would not use our crusher. Remember that nasty crusher that we were using?
Right.
And so they brought in their own. They really wanted to have everything just right. They had their own tanks they brought in. I think because I had good.
They wanted everything just right. They should have got rid of us.
Yeah, then probably. But I think we had things like the Waukesha pump, so we had good equipment. But our crusher was quite unique. Yes, and the delivery system to it was rather interesting. Also,
The behemoth.
Yeah. So it was fun working with them. And
they bought a Delta E4,
yeah,
which I still use to this day at Tablas Creek. I still have that same crusher. We've never upgraded because it works just fine.
It works, yeah.
But those were fun days, and everyone would ask me, what is? Because I didn't really know who Robert Haas was particularly at that time. I hadn't been in the wine business for very long at all, and everyone that was in the business was so excited that I was working with Robert Haas. Like, what's he like? I was like, well,
he's a guy.
He's an older guy in welly boots who's like a kid in a candy store. He's having a great time.
Oh, he was so funny with the Wellington boots on. He just running around wanting to do what he always wanted to do.
I mean, those early vintages where we were making half barrels, fermenting in a barrel with the head popped out because there was nothing else small enough to ferment in. Super exciting. I mean, this is obviously before the Tablas Creek clonal selections were brought into the country, and these were, I think this probably came from Bob Lindquist or on his suggestion, the Marsanne.
Because original planting at Tablas Creek, they were so excited to start that they used American wood.
I always refer to it as like the Impatience Vineyard.
The Impatience Vineyard. And then it took, 3 years to get the stuff through quarantine?
Yeah, I think they came in, the first stuff in the nursery started going in 93, 94. The first real plantings, 95, 97, going on that. And then, of course, I wasn't sure what to make of the whole situation. I could see you were really enamored to have them there because you knew them. I didn't know them at that point. And I, for all intents and purposes, was pretty much convinced you were going to run off with the French and leave me to run Adelaida Cellars.
Well, that was a thought.
But I think they saw wiser that. And I ended up running off to France and working for them at Bookstell and then coming back to be on the property at Tablas, which has proved to be, I mean, we talk about this a lot at Tablas Creek, but at that time when I was working with you at Adelaida Cellars, really Paso Robles was Chardonnay, Cabernet, and Zinfandel.
Yeah.
And that was about it, really, of any substance or substantial amount. If people were doing Pinot, and Gary Everly was doing some Syrah, but it certainly had no great reputation at that point.
And in fact, I'm sort of not embarrassed, but reluctant to admit it at this stage, there was a period there where Paso Robles was déclassé as far as the wine growing area, and on the Adelaida label, I don't know if that one has it on it, but I was not calling it Paso Robles because it was harder to sell as Paso Robles than as either Central Coast or San Luis Obispo County.
This is San Luis Obispo.
Yeah. And then very quickly as things evolved with the Perrons coming into town, later with Stefano Seo, La Ventura, etc. People coming in they were carrying some weight and some reputation that added qualification to what was going on here with the grapes. And then even the big boys like the J. Lors, Kendall Jackson, others in the area that were buying around here were finding out that these weren't just a lower cost grape that they could make for their second label, that these grapes were producing, even grown under what I'd call commodity type of grape conditions. You're not growing it for low yield and the highest expression of the grape. You're growing it for really volume, still quality, but for volume. And it was producing really good wine. That drew that grouping in also in a big way, as we've seen.
I mean, if you look at that moment in time, you look at 1988, let's say, which I was still slaving at a stove in kitchens at that point. But if you look at West Paso Robles at that moment, there was nothing on Adelaida Road, no wineries, that is, except for HMR was there, planted in the 60s, but it was defunct.
And the tasting room was where good old burgers.
Right. And it was no longer producing it. They were selling grapes to concentrate plants for $50 a ton and stuff. I mean, you would get out to Justin and Conway, or out on Chimney Rock Road, and then if you went along Vineyard Drive, I don't think Norman was there yet. The Vineyard probably was, but not the winery. So there was nothing. There was nothing out there. I mean, they went and visited with Gary Everly, of course, because he was making Syrah. He told them they're out of their minds to plant on the west side because they'd freeze every year and the soil was not good enough.
Right.
And he was not wrong in that we do freeze a lot.
Yeah.
We used to. The climate has changed slightly. And
we planned on that.
We did. Yeah. We knew that was coming, right?
Yeah.
But it was I mean, when I look back at it, I didn't really know what way was up in the wine business at that moment in time.
Who did?
Still don't. Really.
Yeah, well, that's,
But the fact that they chose their whole plan, I mean, they could have bought anything they wanted.
Yeah.
They could have been in Napa or Snow, but the fact that they chose something that was apart from the soil, the rainfall, proximity, apart from where it was and what it was, it seemingly didn't have the value for them, and it certainly wasn't any reputation.
There's no reputation. In fact, you go back and at one point we were pushing to try and do sub-appellations out in that area because of the different.
I remember
those. And there were people like Wild Horse, Ken Volk at Wild Horse, Justin, of course, was up and running then. Ourselves at Adelaida, my own La Cuvier, because I'm doing both of them. Tablas was starting, Art Norman, etc., and a number of people.
Pedal Smith was involved in that stuff too.
Right.
Too.
And we were starting to do it, and then we looked to try and apply for a TTB, or in those days a VATF appellation for back there. And all of a sudden we realized that when the Paso Robles appellation was done, they used, I think it was the township line R13, which sort of runs close to where Halter is now, along Vineyard Drive, and it just sort of back and forth. A lot of the grapes that we were calling Paso Robles were not Paso Robles. So we got together with the TTB or the VATF, and we fessed up and said, everybody, all of us, thought that this was Paso Robles. So we they let us use up as we went then for the sub appellations. But there was a big argument about appellations at that time. That's changed.
Okay, so a question from T. McClellan. Given the Adelaida connection, can you guys comment briefly as to what style the best Paso wines were in the 70s? I cannot comment to that, but you probably can you? 70s? You were
70s,
still new in town. But...
It was HMR was certainly Caperone was out there as a total
still
yeah, as a maverick, and there was York Mountain, Pezzenti, Rhoda. Very few wineries. When I first bonded and licensed for Adelaida Cellars, I think there were 6 of us. And a couple of them really didn't count because a lot of the wine came as finished wine in bulk from the Central Valley.
Right.
And in those days, you could label it as produced and bottled by. But what you were seeing is primarily, you can't screw up Zinfandel. It's so, it does itself. But one of the interesting things was HMR, which had Pinot Noir there at Cedra and
Chard and some Cab.
and the Pinot Noir with Andrei Chelachev. We did a retrospective of that at Adelaide up on the hill on the night of dinner, part of KCBX, Archie McLaren and whatnot. And Archie and I had I think it was a Magnum of 77 or something like that, Pinot. And we were tasting the wines before we go out and pour them at the table. And he and I both poured it out. We looked at each other. This can't go to them. It was as good a Burgundy. You know, at that point, it was already about 20 years old.
I feel like Dr. Stanley so often gets overlooked because really, he was the first, in my opinion anyway, he was the first person to come to Paso Robles as the Pren family and Haas families did because of the soil on the west side of town. And in the mid-'60s, he sold that with Telechef and Kane, and everything else was on the east side at that point.
Absolutely. 60s. It didn't make any sense to be on the west side. And it was funny because when Adelaida, the Van Stevens, bought the HMR property with the vineyards, you still go out there and there were IV bottles hanging off.
I have one. You have one somewhere. Glass IV bottles.
Glass IV bottles and injected into the drip system
because he was a cardiologist.
Right. But and he's gotten a lot of notoriety, I think, on people that have been around and remember. But that was a big risk. I think there was some kind of deal he did with a piece of property they had down in Southern California, which was 20 acres or something, and they got 1,000 acres in Paso Robles. And he said, "What the hell are we going to do with this?" That's when I believe he contacted Andrei Chelachev. Chelachev came down and looked at the soils and said, "Pinot." I'm
not sure that was the greatest decision, but it made a nice Pinot Noir.
Oh, it made a very good
ultimately. So maybe it was a good decision, and it's still making those wines are still in Gamay too. They're still making great bottles of wine out of there.
At Adelaida, unbeknownst to my partners at the time, you did the Pinot Noir from there, and we were tasting. It was amusing because we went to Bob Haas. We both talked to Bob and said, "Bob, we want to taste what we're doing with Pinot Noir. We have no real ongoing experience with Burgundy, which is the standard. Can't afford them. Could you recommend a couple of bottles of a couple of labels of a newer Burgundy so we can taste against our wine?" So I'll look at something. I think he sent us 2 cases.
Right.
And the first tasting we did, I recall it very clearly. It was your Pinot Noir. I don't remember the vintage.
91 or 92.
And there were 2 other 91 or 92 Burgundies. One was a Vieux Echezot, a very high-end bottle, another Burgundy, and then yours. And we poured it and we tasted and we recognized that, well, somebody screwed up. They poured the same wine twice. We re-poured, and your HMR Pinot Noir and the Grand Echezot were, very, very close in essence and everything else.
That should be so much more famous.
I know, yeah. The only, if we found anything, is that the Echezot was slightly darker, I think, or something like that. But it had
too dark,
even.
Perhaps.
It had that what HMR gave and what was going on and starting to develop relationships or reputations.
I still have some of that.
Yeah. Oh, you do. When we're going to get to drink some of that?
And it has. You remember we did the corks of Adelaide that said on the cork. It has those corks in it.
I forgot.
Yeah. The last time we did one of these shows, it was with John Priest, who was my partner in that crime. And we made 2 vintages, and then you went, the Van Stevens went and bought the vineyard, and I never got to make another vintage.
Neither did I. At least not for myself.
No, but there's still, Jeremy, who's the winemaker at Adelaida now, is across the board, I think he's making the best wines that have come out of that winery since we
since us, of course. But
it pales in comparison to our day, but he's doing some really nice. I don't know if you've had any of the wines, but he's doing some nice work.
Yes, I have, and they're very.
He's a bit more meticulous than you and I were, maybe.
He probably kings up a little.
Not always a good thing.
Yeah, but it goes back to the thing that you were talking about, is that the area was not known for special, unique, etc. People will say better than or not as good as. Well, I don't think that's a point. It's rather that the different growing conditions allow for these very distinctly different grapes that produce very distinctly different wines. And until Stanley Hoffman did what he did, and then until Bob Haas and the Perrons came in and did what they did, etc., not much was going on. Justin Winery was just a little winery out out in the boondocks. Chardon Cab. And it was when Steve Glossner did that one cab, what was it, 94, that got the top line or something. All of a sudden because before that there were 4 tanks under an awning.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that was the springboard to take them.
I just thinking back to those days. You remember the day it was my birthday and Jean-Pierre tried to kill me. I was standing up on the behemoth, like 20 feet off the ground, trying to fix a hydraulic hose that he'd broken. And the bin dumper was up in the air and I had my feet on 2 really narrow little rails. And I'm just like, okay, just wait. And he just dumped the whole bin right on top of me.
I forgot.
And the bin fell out and hit me. I had to dig my way out of the hopper. There was a cloud. You remember this? There was a cloud just over Adelaida Hills that day and it rained on us.
There was a cloud once up on top of the hill when Kelly Mallarney did that dinner and we sat out and drank whiskey and it came over, rained on us and went on. It was not bigger than this table.
I think that travels with Kelly Mallarney. So what do you think? Give some Munch nonsense about that Marsanne.
It's become that wonderful bottle aging where it's gone away from being just the grapey character and it's gone into the bottle bouquet, which is, to me, it's stone fruit and a richness, a viscosity that wouldn't have been there in the early days. So it's interesting how the wines will evolve.
It's a pretty cool savory character to it. It's lost a bit of its. Though Marsanne to me never has massive fruit, but this has evolved really, really well. I mean, I would not have imagined. And we're actually finding that to this day that the wines that I'm loving now, the Marsannes, are the ones out of the 2014s, the 2010s now are tasting really, really good.
Did you answer the question that came through?
What was the question? What's the question? Ian.
It was about the wines from the 70s or something like that. Yeah.
I wasn't around in the 70s. I was strolling around Bristol with a yellow hen or something. So this is the Le Cuvier Syrah. This has been the 3rd vintage of this wine.
Vintage, yeah.
I believe
the last vintage.
The last vintage, yeah, because now you ripped it out. It was this horrible little vineyard.
Yeah, that was my first experience on viticulture, and one of the takeaways was I put it on trellis wire. You do not pull trellis wires around corners.
No. I remember your wife, Andre, bless her, making me go spread buckets of breezy horse poop.
Well, the horse poop on it. One story about it is the vineyard was difficult, and I was learning. I did learn some stuff on how to do with grapes, but not how to plant them. And Andre had, when I went on a trip to Europe, she didn't want me to leave her at the house alone unless she had protection. So she had me buy a sawed-off shotgun. She lived in a little village in France, and everybody lived close together, so it was scary for her. And I was out one day, and we had everything fenced. A rabbit had gotten in, and I went out with a shotgun. I don't kill things. That's not what I do. But I went there, and the rabbit ran, and just instinctually I pulled. There was this puff of fur. I said, "Oh God, I killed a rabbit!" And then I look over, and a bunch of the vines had been severed by. It was like a 12-gauge shotgun, with buckshot or something.
Should not have been in your hands.
I was really pissed off at the rabbit at that point. Next time I turned on the drip irrigation.
Andre never let you touch that.
Never let. The turkey would get the fruit just as it was ripe, and my obligation and what I was doing was, as we were working in Adelaida, everything was coming in, and my little bit of Syrah was about 1,000 vines is all, very small. The most it ever produced was 3 barrels. Mostly it produced like 1.5 barrels, and so it would just lag, and then come back just when it was ready to pick. And the turkeys were quite pleased. They were just taking the whole thing out.
This is tasting remarkable. It really is. I've always liked this wine, but I haven't had it in decades.
I should rip out the winery and plant there.
You should.
Yeah.
You should run that by Mary.
I should go for that.
It's smelling beautiful, like really gamey and violets, and really not showing its age to me that much. Really, I mean, obviously it's a little age on it, but
yeah,
it's
bottle
pretty
bouquet
vibrant. I love the spicy character. Someone brought this up the other day. Someone had a bottle of the Tablas Creek, I think it was a 96 Viognier, that Jean-Pierre and Bob Haas hand bottled in the cellar at Adelaida. And Jean-Pierre wouldn't let me help him because he knew how to run the bottle. And there was wine just going everywhere. It was hilarious. That wine is still tasting really good.
That was funny. Just another Bob Haas story. You and I came out once into one of the tanks he was trying to either circulate or rack the wine from. And Bob had trouble with mechanical stuff, and especially with figuring out how to get the valves, because in those days, I think those tanks were not the unisex type of fittings. They were the I-line. Yeah. So you have to use adapters and whatnot. We came out, it looked like a petroleum distillery, you know, the number of things he had going on the valves. But he was in his Wellingtons and just having a hell of a good time.
I remember him walking past me in the cellar. I was coming into the cellar, out of the cellar, and he was coming in. He had a little plastic lab boat full of white powder, and he walked past me, and I just kind of glanced as he went by, and I didn't think much of it. I said, "Whoa, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm going to add this SO2 to the whichever tank it was," and I kind of went, "Wait." And he had scooped chlorine instead of SO2. And I told him, and he just laughed like whatever.
He's like a little kid. He was just having a great
It was
time.
great. I had such a good time with that.
Yeah.
And with him always.
Yeah.
You know. And the first Foudre, 1995, which we still have, and it's Foudre number 3 in our Foudre room. I remember being so excited when that thing arrived. If you remember those days, and the priest put a picture of the Virgin Mary on it, and Bob took it off.
The priest was had been hired in to start the nursery. Dick Honus was really a character. Start the nursery, get the initial plantings gone and whatnot. But he had been a former Catholic priest. We always claimed that he'd been defrocked, but
still claim that.
Yeah.
So I can see why this turned their heads. I really can. It's a shame this vineyard isn't still there.
Yeah. And it was young vines. I mean, well, this would have been actually probably the 7th year or something like that. But I'm sure I didn't take any fruit until 7, 8.
Is there a pivotal moment, do you think, when Paso Robles really made a jump forward? Because we're talking about 70s, there wasn't much going on. In the 88, there wasn't a whole lot going on. I mean, you were here, and I guess that's when Volk came to town, sort of,
Yeah.
right?
Well, Volk had already been started, but he was very nervous about being here because of
Nervous about
everything. He wanted to do Pinot Noir, and he used to visit with Andre quite a bit when she was running the tasting room out at what had been Tablas Winery, not
Right,
Las Tablas, yeah. And I think what had happened, a few people were starting to come into the area and discover it, but the public really hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it took things like the Justin 94, I guess their wine, getting the incredibly high ratings, so that brought the general wine public to it. With Adelaida, we were on the Cabernet. I think we were in the top 3 wines from when we used to do the competition nonsense and whatnot. We won a double golden, the only double gold in San Francisco, and I go up there and try and flog some wine, some of the cab, walk into the place, "Oh, you got the double gold, wonderful. And where are you from?" Paso Robles. "Oh, it's veggie." He wouldn't even taste it.
Right.
You know, so you had that to fight against, and therefore you say on the bottle something that pulled you away from Paso until such time as you started to get the people coming in, and then the wines like the Steve Glossner's 94, I'm pretty sure it was. And then with Justin Smith, his wine, it's taken that, and it's taken really people that have a French accent like Stefan Sale to be able to do things also. It required that kind of thing. There's a wonderful cartoon, I think it was in the New Yorker from way back when. It's a guy coming into a wine shop, and he said, "I want my money back. This is the worst wine I've ever tasted." And the salesman behind the counter with his nose up in the air said, "That just won a 98 at the Wine Spectre. I'll take a case."
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a little bit.
Well, it's always struck me as ironic that, you know, you're saying the people up north are saying veggie, or those Paso Robles don't want it. However, at that point, 80% of the grapes grown in Paso Robles were going up north.
We're going up north.
Right? You know,
I think the justification was that a lot of the things like cab that was grown in the Salinas Valley were grown with a lot of water, and they expressed whatever the name of the compound is in grapes that make it taste like bell pepper and asparagus and stuff.
Pyrazines.
Is that what it's called? So there was some justification. Those vineyards can grow incredible Cabernet with water control, overwatering, and you get that veggie character. We didn't have that issue here. So the grapes are very ripe.
That's an interesting thing to me now too. I've spoken about this a lot lately with people. You know, I mean, Tablas Creek, I'm only really planting dry farm vineyard at this point. Lone Madrone, we only buy from dry farm vineyard pretty much at this point.
That's what we do also.
However, when I was working with you, I don't remember his name, but he would come in every year and try his damnedest to sell us fruit from the Wilpeat vineyard, which is the Uberoff vineyard, which was planted in 1886, and nobody wanted anything to do with it.
Nope.
Dry farm was rubbish.
Yeah.
You know, now, I mean, Turley has it now, but those vineyards are the most sought after stuff.
Oh, sure.
Town. You know, it's just weird how trends. I remember tasting those samples of the Wilpeat with you, and I was both
I do recall that on the first time that Neil Zutz and Castoro and we had the winery we'd set up together after Estrella sort of went into their little bankruptcy issues. And we moved into the place that my French Champagne people bought the property, built the building. Neil Zutzen came in with all the equipment. So we had the big tanks, refrigeration, all the kinds of nonsense, and the 6-inch hoses or whatever they are. And we had built one of the little open top tanks.
You don't use 6-inch hoses anymore?
Don't use hoses. And we built one of those open tops, those 8-foot diameter open tops. We had one of those done. And Utzen and I walked into the winery during harvest. It's early morning. There were 13 big tanks, all full of wine fermenting. And we walk in and say, "What is that?" And it was the Wilpeat, the Uberoff, fermenting in that little tank. It was like 3 tons. Again,
smelling?
Oh, taking over the whole winery. The scent that you got, I thought, there's got to be something there.
We should have put our foot on that.
Yeah. We got it as Adelaida for quite a bit of time. And then
it was after my time.
Yeah.
In that case, we didn't ever use it.
Yeah.
When I was there, we were using Doozy, Mission View,
Martinelli.
and Martinelli.
I think I got it because of Steve Goldman at York Mountain had the connection there. We were getting part of it together. We'd sort of do things together.
Golda Manini.
Yeah.
He's out now. No, not making wine at all.
He's a wise fellow.
Fishing.
Yeah.
This is stunning.
It's held lovely. I mean, it's just got better.
All of that. You should probably leave that.
Will do.
So let's move along in the name of haste. So Lone Madrone.
96.
So this came from, and I tell the story often, my first job with you, my first day at work at Adelaida Hills, you gave me a pen and a notebook.
Did you know how to write?
The technical director, well, you thought I did apparently at that point, and sent me to the bar room and made me make notes on everything. And the note on the Carver Vineyard, which would have been the 1990 vintage, was, "This should be by itself." And I remained in that. We bought those ridiculous Italian handmade bottles or whatever.
Oh golly,
the bottoms fell out of
the bottoms all fell out. Yeah, because we'd also gold leaf them. It was like a hot process. They had to go through an oven and it fractured all the bottles.
I remember first one we were doing samples and I put it on the hand corker and put a cork in it, lifted it up, and the bottom stayed on the corker and all the wine just. I ended up having to go through every bottle with a flashlight, and I'm sure you didn't help a bit.
Oh, you couldn't see through those bottles anyway.
You had to look at the punt on the bottom of the bottle, and the ones that were broken had a little crack in it.
A little fracture.
So we threw away like a third of those bottles.
I think, to go back to you going in and with the notes of what you saw, I don't know where I came up with that concept. It was probably Andre, I don't know. And it was sort of like you had worked in restaurants, you'd worked for Wild Horse for a little bit of time.
Yeah, that was good.
But it was sort of like, okay, I don't need somebody with an enology degree, etc. I want somebody who knows how to taste and taste wine. I think when you showed up, when you interviewed for Adelaida, he showed up in that old Volvo held together with baling wire.
554.
Yeah, and that was sort of like, that's a plus. He can fix things and can make that work. Okay, that's what we do at the winery. And then finding out that you were a chef and were used to working the 18-hour days. I said, well, that's a plus.
Yeah.
And let's see how his nose works. And it was all about how you were able to perceive. You didn't know wine speak, but you were spot on with your nostril at the time. And you know, your cooking background is extraordinary. You should tell the story of how you used to prepare cauliflower in Bristol. Tell that story. Come on.
Yeah. All right. So first, I'm not sure this is Tablas Creek appropriate, but whatever. Let's go for it. So the first job I worked at, I was 15, 16, working in a kitchen in Bristol. And I got all my friends hired as dishwashers. And at the end of the night, the owner chef who was training me would go up to his apartment above, and the drunks would be staggering up the street. And there was a huge window, like massive window that looked out onto the street from the kitchen. It's like the first like open kitchen in a way, I guess. And the drunks would come staggering from the Coach and Horses pub past the window, and there was a fan that was in the window. And we used to wait until someone was coming by and throw cooked cauliflower into the fan, and it would rain on the guy who'd stack up.
So that's when your expertise started.
Exactly. So my life as a chef. But yeah, I mean, those two things did. You don't remember anything, but you always remember that.
Well, of course, I remember the important things.
And it is a very good connection between food and wine, and that was important. But from that, I decided that I was going to make it myself, because we always blended it into the Adelaida Cabernet Sauvignon. So yeah. I borrowed some money from Stewie's mom, and we both made a cab same year. This was made, by this time we had gone, in 1993, you and I did our first trial with native yeast. By 1994, we were only using native yeast, and I've never used a commercial yeast since. So this was made at Castora, so there was ambient yeast in the air, no doubt. But in the 8x4 fermenters, in those days, gosh, it was there, and I was I was doing laboring for Rich Simons at Silverhorse, and it was aged there. And then bottled it. It's holding up incredibly well to me.
And that vineyard is
wine of this age.
And that vineyard is such a dramatically good vineyard.
It is. We did I don't know if you saw the stuff Jordan and I were doing, the tasting in the Westview during the pandemic stuff. We did the Lone Madrone pickup party out of my Westphalia van. We parked it under the tree.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, barely got there, but it's still producing great wines. I mean, Calcaris has the
What was the name of the manager that lived on the property? Wano?
Rains.
John Rains. Whose mother is buried under that tree, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not surprised. Are you waving at me, Ian? Okay, the question. I take him back to Neil's old conversations with the winemaker. Yeah, those were before their time a bit, I reckon. I loved watching those. Do you remember that?
Mm.
You and I.
It's a whole bottle of Calvados, if I'm not mistaken.
It was a whole bottle. Unfortunately, Joel, who filmed those, lost the second half of our interview because I think it was almost incoherent.
It was supposed to be a half-hour interview, and we went for
hours. Yeah, hours. We drank wine, and we finished a whole bottle of Calvados. It was fantastic. But those, we've been going back and looking at some of those, and I think I may try and do them again with the same people, because it's been a dozen years, I think, since we did that. Yeah. It would be kind of fun to see how everybody's regressed since that time.
I don't know how many brain cells have gone and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So this is, to me, classic Carver still. Has a kind of black currant notes. I mean, there's definitely a bit of the jalapeno, which some people don't like. I've always loved about it.
It's a young wine. It's still a young wine. I mean, you're looking at almost 34 years.
24 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, who knew? I wasn't thinking about anything. I certainly wasn't thinking that I might have to try and sell the stuff.
Oh, that was a problem, wasn't it?
It was, and you didn't tell me. Yeah,
I told you most things.
Yeah. Led me on. Well, let's move on to your version of the same. They both have a beautiful tartrate sediment across the bottle.
And you're pretty sure that this is Lone Madrone also, the vineyard. I have no recollection of anything that happened beyond yesterday. So
I mean, unless you made another Cabernet in
I don't think so.
1996, because we both fermented in tanks right next to each other with Mr. Utzon.
So that's what would happen.
Took our money.
Because we weren't using it. I would not compete with my own winery with Adelaida, since I was in partnership with the Van Seewings. The grapes that would go to Adelaida, what Adelaida needed was first dibs, and that I don't think it started to go. We got some for Adelaida, I think, in the subsequent years.
Yeah, no, the Adelaida still got their share, and this year we just took some on top of it. And then in 1997, Adelaida, basically, I was gone, so bad decisions started getting made. No, in 1997, the Viking Ranch came online, I believe.
Yeah.
I spoke to Sowerby earlier in the week, and he said that the Viking Ranch then replaced the Carver. I never bought very much. I mean, I think we bought 3 tons the first year.
It was always a small amount also. Yeah, because at 97, I still have some of the Viking from 97. And that was the one we did in the big fat bottles, I think also. I did some in, I'm pretty sure I've got some of that lying around.
I do remember Jordan and I were talking about bottling. He's choosing a new bottle for a project that we're doing. And I remember we bought the Sangiovese bottle from McGillis. Remember Jerry McGillis or something? Kelly's mother or aunt or something. Anyway, it was a Sangiovese, and we bought the Bellissima bottle. It was this Italian thing. It was tall and elegant.
Very Italian, very phallic.
Yeah, exactly. We just neglected to ask the bottling line if it would fit through the line, and it didn't. It crashed into the corker, and they couldn't do it. That's a bottle if I had. The things you
Little
learn.
mistakes,
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, these wines were made the same. They were made.
They're very similar.
I mean, we were using a lot of American oak at Adelaida in those days, all American oak, in fact, A and K primarily.
Yeah.
But by that time, we were playing with different forests of American oak from Seagram Road, Pennsylvania, I think, and blah, blah, blah. But we went neutral, both of us, to steer away from that style.
That was from my recollection, that was impressed upon me by both Jean-Pierre and Francois Perrin. In the initial period when they did the 96 at Adelaida, they'd asked to taste a Zinfandel in process. And they were thinking, as I understood it, they were thinking of Zinfandel as being a Rhone-like grape in a way because of its, almost rustic, big and whatnot. So we went and tasted from barrels. And in those days, I was using 100% New Oak and Pinot, 100% in Cabernet and Chardonnay. Zinfandel, I'll only use about 30% New Oak because, it doesn't need it. And to impress them, I pulled a sample out of whatever the vineyard lot was out of a new barrel. And they smelled it and they turned to me and they said, "Why are you ruining this wine with all of this oak? What are you talking about? Like 17% alcohol fruit bomb." But I went back afterwards, saying, I went to the French now. Went back afterwards with a couple of glasses and took a sample out of a neutral barrel, which was a barrel that had maybe been used 5 or 6 years, and then a sample from the same batch of Zinfandel wine from a new barrel. And I still like the new barrel because I was used to that oak component, but I had to admit to myself I could taste the wine and taste the vineyard and the distinction of the vineyard without the new oak. I think that I bought a little bit of new oak the following year, and after that it's been neutral oak the whole way.
Nothing to do with the fact that you're just cheap.
I'm cheap too, but no. Right. In fact, our biggest problem now is finding barrels that have at least 5 years of use. Most people have already turned them to planters by then.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's easy. We bought barrels for a project that Jordan and I were doing. It's a barrel called I think it's called a T5. It's Terence So's. It's $1,500 a barrel. And we bought them 2 years old for $150. Yeah, it's crazy.
Too much oak in that.
On that note, I don't know if I've told you this story. It's kind of a really fun story. I was right before Turley bought the Martinelli vineyard, which was planted in 1921 or something by Amadeo Martinelli. We worked with it. That's where I knew it from. And if you remember, amongst the Zinfandel, there are some other vines which Bruno Martinelli used to call the Burgunder.
Yes,
Remember that?
they were up towards the upper road,
Most of them were up there. There's a few down low.
along and interplanted with the cherry
interplanted.
trees.
So I decided when I bought, you shared it with me actually, but I harvested those all separately, and by that time they were calling it Grenache. So I thought, well, I'm doing Rhone stuff, I'll make it separately. So I made it separately, and Claude, who was the vineyard guy and winemaker for Beaucastel for the Prem family, just retired after 40 years, came to visit, and we went to the Lone Madrone cellar just for fun. We're tasting through, and I tasted him on that Grenache. And he tasted it, and he looked at me, and he just kind of shook his head and said, "This isn't Grenache." And I told him, "Well, I mean, it's possible that it's not." And he said, "Well, I want to see the vineyard." So we jumped in the car, we drove over to Marsanne, we looked at the vines, we'll throw this in. And he's like, "Where?" And he sees them. He goes, "Those are Grenache. That's the vines that wine came from." And he said, "We have to go back to the cellar." So we got to jump in the car, we drive back to the cellar, we retaste. He thinks about it, and he looks at me and goes, "This is Grenache that's been living too long with Zinfandel."
Perfect. Yeah. So perfect.
Justification. Made everybody happy. This is holding up beautifully. It's different, certainly, than the Madrone. There's a little more meaty character going on there.
Oh, that's because I made it.
Yeah, I didn't say it was better.
Notice the bottle's taller. That must
Yeah, I
be
do. And champagne green. It's hard to get a champagne green bottle these days. I've been trying to move Lone Madrone to all champagne green. You can't get them. Not in screw
If you're willing to pay the price.
Yeah, I'm not. I learned to be cheap from you.
No, they're both. It speaks
beautiful.
It speaks to the vineyard. It speaks to why we were both attracted to it.
Yeah, and it's still a fabulous vineyard. It's still. I mean, it's older. I think it was planted in '88. I told you I called Steve. I emailed Steve Goldman, who was part of planning it with Guano, and asked him when it was planted, and he said, "Oh, he will tell me if I go to his house and have a drink with him." So
I thought it was planted in the 70s.
No, I think it was. I thought it was.
It was planted at different times too. There,
right?
So
there's Pinot on it. There's planted
there was
later.
Pinot and there was Chardonnay.
We used to make Chardonnay, which was
Chardonnay
beautiful.
And yeah, it was Grand Chardonnay, and then there was the Cab, and I think even the Cab was planted in two sections. If I'm not.
It's one of my early learning experiences was with that vineyard. I couldn't afford it, and poor Marcy, and I paid for, was it the carvers that still owned it at that point, to graft all the Cabernet that run under the Madrone tree to Cabernet for me. So I could buy Cabernet that was actually under the tree.
Because it would have been Chardonnay.
It had been Chardonnay,
yeah.
and no one wanted the Chardonnay. So I said, I'll pay for the grafting. And just as it was about to bear fruit, Calcaris bought the vineyard, or at least all vineyard wouldn't let me have any of it. But they let me have it back now generously. Jason Joyce has been really generous, and I made this wine every year, 96, 97, 98.
98 was that one year. I still have some. It was, in fact, the Adelaida version of, or maybe it's the Le Cuvier version of 98 Cabernet is Lone Madrone. And
we should clarify here a minute.
Yeah.
So the vineyard has a single Madrone tree that stands right at the top of it. And the nickname for it was the Carver Vineyard, but all those that knew it, John and Golmanini, and one called it the Lone Madrone Vineyard. So when I started my label, I called the owners and asked if I could use that name for my label. So that's confusing.
And the 98 was a cold year. I remember that Pinot Noir was really, as a consequence, was very Burgundian than we did. And other wines were lovely. And the Cabernet from the Carver Vineyard, the Lone Madrone Vineyard, was properly mature. It would make like a 13.5% alcohol wine, etc. So it was fine. But my aging it and tasting it and put it into the bottle, it tasted okay, but it was not typical to what we do. So we actually decanted about half of it to blend with some Zinfandel and a Bat Cuvée label because it just didn't fit. It wouldn't sell. And I kept a bunch of it back because I just said, no, I'm not going to do it all. And a number of years ago, I was down in the wine library up at Le Cuvier, and we were tasting old Cabernets, and I was talking to people. Some years the area does have vintages. Some years just don't work, etc. Let me pull an example. I think we've been tasting 94 cab, 96 cab, a 2000 cab or something. Let me pull the 98, poured that, and it kicked butt on everything. And it finally become a Bordeaux, because it was a Bordeaux-like year. Before that, it was just sort of tight, lean, not appealing, and it's just a wonderful wine now.
Well, that may be so.
I should get you a bottle of that.
But I made my 98 at Golbanini's place at York Mountain, and it was raining, and he strung tarps to keep the water out of the fermenters.
And the tarps,
it went right into my fermenter.
So how's that wine doing these days?
I don't know. Stewie took it when the partnership broke up.
Did you know?
Yeah. So
I'll have to get you a bottle of that, because
so I did 96, I did 97, I didn't do 98 because of that business, and our partnership broke up, and Stewie took all the wine and I kept the name. 99, 2000, and then somewhere in there I lost access to it because Calcaris took it.
Calcaris,
and I started buying York Mountain Cab from Gibbs, which is a bit higher up.
Yeah.
And I did that for maybe 4 years, and then went back. And then the first vintage since 98 that I haven't made one was 2020, because it just didn't work for me.
Yep.
So, and I'll still, as long as Jason Joyce keeps hooking me up and the Calcaris guys are generous enough to let me buy it, I'll keep making it, because it's what we started for. It's the first wine that I became excited about with Adelaida, and I'll keep trying to.
Bottle of whiskey for a bottle of my 98.
Okay.
Okay, we're done.
What's a bottle of whiskey for an unripe cant? That's so what you can no longer tell when it was unripe.
No, it's glorious now. It just took over. It had all of that elegance.
We're gonna have to drink this because our gum bucket's full.
Okay.
Any questions, Ian? What are you doing over there? You've done a darn thing this whole time, have you? Edward Sierra. I hope the show is retained for future views by everyone who didn't enjoy it today. A wonderful peek into the history of West Paso. Oh, that's nice. Oh, Jordan Collins is on there. Not a word to say, just a smiley face. Jordan turned 30, John Munch. When I interviewed with you,
he was in nappies.
He was. When I interviewed you, he was not even one.
No, he was very. And I have to tell the story when we got the application letter from you. We hadn't been looking, but you sent out something. And when you showed up with Jordan and Marcy up at the house where La Cuvier is now, you couldn't speak English, I think, at that time.
I was speaking English.
No, you didn't know how to speak English. And it became very clear that Marcy wrote the letter.
No.
Yes. And also, had there been a winery in the area called Aardvark, you started,
right.
That's where you would have gone.
No, it was first in the Yellow Pages.
That's right.
That was what I did. I went to write letters to a harvest at a winery. Yellow Pages. Adelaida. Okay. And then this French woman called me from the hills of Adelaida.
Yes.
Off I go, and then I get you.
Yeah.
The interview. Not what I was hoping for.
She did teach you how to clean toilets, so
she did. She tried. I refused. Yeah. Ruthie.
Yeah. It was a wild place for a while.
There was a lot of fun that was had at that time, and some really changed a lot. I mean, I still maintain a lot of the same winemaking practices that we developed during that time. I mean, finishing reds in barrel,
no yeast,
native yeast.
You were the one that was badgering me. So we ought to try and make some wine without sulfite. I'm sure you were the one that said that.
Probably so.
And so all our wines are now done without sulfite for the first couple of years. They're just the fermentation, etc., encourage spoilage.
Yeah. The interesting stuff.
Yeah, that way the wine's not going to spoil because it spoils in the bottle. It's already spoiled.
Okay, we're going to go. So we had the 96 Marsanne. I'm not going to say that this is a 2018 Marsanne from Tablas Creek, and this will have incorporated some of the French vine plantings that were planted. I don't remember when they were planted, but it would have been somewhere in probably 1999, I think, if I remember correctly. But there will be a large percentage of the original planting in this bottle too, and this is the current release of Marsanne from Tablas. And I've become more and more enamored with the Marsanne as time has gone on. I mean, for years, Bob Haas was trying to rip it out because he just didn't like it. And it's taken time, and you hear this all the time, but perhaps more than any other grapevine, I have found that the Marsanne having age on the vine has really improved the wine. And then the wines with age are fantastic.
For our own wine, and we buy all our grapes. I had used Marsanne and I avoided it because I found it not having whatever, and instead looking at Roussanne and Viognier. But indeed, the Marsanne seems to be something that it does take that time for the vine to start expressing itself. I mean, the vines are, it's a truism, I suppose, that grapes come from vines. Well, what a concept.
If only you told me that.
Yeah. But
what's interesting, right? It's such a long process, I mean, Jean-Pierre Perrin once said to me, we learn about this much in a vintage, and we can just hope that we get to use that again someday.
Yes.
Which is such a truism for me. But I was standing up on a new planting we're doing with Austin this week up at Tablas Creek, up on Jewel Ridge. We just planted about almost 20 acres of traditional 12 by 12 diamond pattern dry farm vineyard, which is really exciting. And I'm standing there with him saying, it's going to be 20 years before this really shows any of what its potential is.
Right.
By which time I'm going to be almost as old as Munch. So it'd be lucky if I'm still alive.
I'll be around, probably carrying chains and making noises.
I'll be wheeling you out there.
Yes.
But it's such a long-term thing. Yeah, we'll get excited about the first harvest, and we'll be singing and dancing about how great the wine is in the 5th, 6th year. But the reality being,
and then you have to let it age to see what happens as it ages.
Yeah, in 30 years, that vineyard's going to be one of the best vineyards in town. I have no question. But it's such an odd thing for me, because I'm a very impatient human, to be putting all this effort in something that I know that
you're not going to get
20 years from now is when it's really going to start singing.
And it's not going to show for even beyond that. Yeah. So what I did at Le Cuvier is I put in a library to collect all the bottles, but I kept putting aside cases, and it holds about 9,000 bottles. I think we have about 8,000 in it at this stage. And the whole idea was to be able to go back through all the vintages, tasting the same variety or looking at a specific vintage to see what we learned. The problem is I don't recall what we did.
Didn't learn anything, did you?
Oh, isn't this interesting? So it's sort of, it's fun, but I do have some information, but none of the, had I been like John, Ken Volk, I would have known everything and kept records of it, but I didn't keep records. I thought my head never worked that well anyway.
It's my favorite line I always use when I'm in a situation when people are asking me how the early part of my career. So my first harvest, I worked for Ken Volk, who did everything by the book and beyond.
Yeah.
And then my second harvest with John Munch, who didn't even know there was a book.
Still don't.
Still hasn't seen that book. So this is tasting beautiful.
Yeah.
Blowing me on the horn a bit. But backpedal a little bit, and Jason always likes to tell this story, and I think it's just speaks to the great wisdom of his father, Robert Haas. Took Jason aside early on in the Tablas Creek when Jason first arrived on the property and said, I just want you to understand that I didn't plant this vineyard for me, and I didn't plant it for you. I planted this vineyard for your kids, there's so much truth in that.
And he'd gotten that from his work with...
Totally. He knew it. He understood it. He understood this is a multi-generational thing, and that's why he was doing it. And for me, that's why it's always been such a pleasure, and why it may seem boring to many that I've been at the same place for so many years, but that mindset and the way they do business, knowing that this is for the long haul and it's a family thing, and having my kid in the cellar is pretty cool. There was a moment last harvest where Austin took a photograph of it, not thinking, I was just taking a photograph of the proud father watching his kid climb around on food rows, and he was filling the last food row to complete the food room for the first time. And I'm just saying, oh, there he is climbing, would be a good little post for Tablas Creek. And then as I'm walking away, I'm thinking, look at that. I filled the first Tablas Creek food room in 1995, and there's my kid filling the last food room in that food room, which is pretty fun to think about.
And then his kid's gonna.
He was 1 year old when I filled that first food run.
Nappies.
Yeah, he was. He still wasn't. Well,
Oh, yes, it is
as
time.
always, we've gone on too long, it seems, and as much as I like, we should probably have a nip. As tradition speaks, we must.
Well,
It's not Irish, I'm afraid, but it's not even great. But
well, for the drive.
we'll do it. It is brown. Cheers.
Cheers.
It's great to see you.
Likewise.
Cheers, everybody out there. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Rambling on. Sorry we didn't answer too many questions. I was a bit too absorbed in what we're talking about. Ian has something to say. Oh, I've got to look at the camera. Sorry, I'm looking at the screen. Look here. Thanks for being here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a good conversation. I mean, the last time we did this with the conversations, the winemaker, the end was the same. We ran out of time, and there should have been an installment 2. So maybe we'll do another one in a couple of months and continue on what's happened since then and taste some more old wines. You know, there's a lot we can get into with this situation. So,
Old wines with old winemakers. What a concept.
well, one old winemaker.
Yeah, there you go.
Cheers, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and hope you enjoyed it. Vintage Paso. Come to Paso. Drink Paso wine
And whiskey too.
and whiskey.